Welcome to Housing Matters, the Vancouver Real Estate Show. This is episode 5. I'm your host, Stuart McNish. Today we're talking about the industrial land crisis in Greater Vancouver and the Fraser Valley. However, just before we get started, I want to let you know about a couple of other podcasts worth your time. The first is White Towel, hosted by Paul Chapman. Paul and a series of guest hosts bring you everything you want to and need to know about the Vancouver Canucks. News, rumors, theories, and themes. And for all you taxpayers, which is all of us, you'll want to tune in to In the House, hosted by two of BC's top journalists covering the ledge, Mike Smith and Rob Shaw. Listen in on Apple Podcasts, VancouverSun.com, and TheProvince.com, where Mike and Rob break down the latest in Victoria and the latest on how the government is spending your money. And that brings me to today's show. Joining me today are Heather Mcnall of Metro Vancouver, Chris Mccauley of CBRE, and Derek Penner of the Vancouver Sun. The topic, industrial land, or as Chris Mccauley likes to call it, jobs land. And that's because industrial properties are home to thousands of jobs. And without industrial land, businesses and industries can't grow. And in some cases, they can't even start, at least not here. And that can be an issue. So joining me now is Heather Mcnall, the Director of Regional Planning for Metro Vancouver. Heather, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me. It's good of you to come in, especially on such a blustery, wintry day out there. We're recording this in advance of when it's airing, but it snowed like the Dickens last night.
For Vancouver, yeah.
Yeah, so I really appreciate you coming in. Now, let's start with an overview of where we're at as far as industrial land is concerned, particularly in Metro Vancouver, because that's your jurisdiction. Where are we at? How do we get here? And what do we do, or how do we start to address a situation that, by all accounts, is starting to become a big concern?
Well, I think I'll take us back a bit if I could. So Metro Vancouver's interest around industrial land started in the early 2000s. And we were hearing from a lot of our member jurisdictions that we were seeing a lot of conversion of industrial land and job space and starting to worry about what that would mean to the functioning of the region, especially in a port economy as well. And so our first work was to try to get a handle on what was happening. And we conducted our first inventory of industrial land in 2005. And
going back 14 years ago.
About 14 years.
Wow.
And we did another one in 2010, and that started to give us a sense of seeing the trends of what was actually getting converted. We completed our third inventory in 2015, and what we saw was not only a conversion of land, but a growing use of industrial lands for non-industrial purposes. So there's two problems really happening. So we're seeing that, yes, land still is getting converted from industrial purposes to residential, mixed use. Waterfront land is at a premium, and we don't have as many mills, sites, and so on around our region anymore. And so those lands become very valuable from a residential perspective.
Now, maybe you can clarify something for me. Sam Sullivan pointed out that when you develop on former industrial lands, the density rules and regulations that might exist as far as other residentially zoned areas are different. You can get greater density in an industrial land, and that makes it even more attractive. Is he right about that, or have I misunderstood?
Well, my understanding is that most of those would have to be rezoned from industrial to a residential, and they'd try to, of course, get a higher density in certain locations around the region. So yes, that would happen, but it would be rezoned from industrial to residential in that
But if
case.
they could do that, it makes it that much more attractive.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
So we've gotten to a place where that conversion is happening, but we're also seeing, again, as I mentioned, a growing use of industrial lands for non-industrial purposes. They've become really de facto job lands in many cases, and so we're seeing everything from indoor recreation facilities, climbing gyms, karate studios, doggy daycares, etc. And we're also seeing a trend towards stratification or smaller lots and smaller lots on our industrial land.
Like a business park or something.
Like a business park, and that's great in some cases because it allows some businesses smaller to own.
Yes.
But it also means that it displaces larger industrial activities like logistics and distribution and so on. So we're really seeing that there's a crunch, as you mentioned. We're seeing record vacancy lows. And so last year we're seeing 1.8, 1.7% vacancy in the region. And my understanding now is we're under 1.4 and in some submarkets under 1%.
And that is in keeping now with residential
That's right.
rental properties, which traditionally the two are not linked like that. There's a much higher sort of vacancy rate.
Yeah, we always think of it healthy in a 4 to 6 range.
So if it took this long for us to get a handle on it and see what the trend was, and there's a very long gestation period in the development of lands and properties, how then do we start to address this in a way that is going to meet timely needs?
It's a great question. So just last year, the then chair of Metro Vancouver Board struck an industrial lands task force to develop a regional industrial lands strategy. And so that really was the idea of bringing all the member jurisdictions together, but also some other industrial interests around the region. So the port is at the table, UDI, we have the ALC, the Agricultural Land Commission, and others to kind of tackle this problem together. And our new chair, Chair Dollywall at Metro Vancouver, has restruck that with the objective of having that strategy done this year. And so really we're trying to tackle four main issues. One is around supply. The other is around ongoing pressures for multiple uses of industrial land. The third interest they have is looking at site issues. So there's real challenges for some of the larger sites. You mentioned servicing earlier. And so servicing access to the goods movement network, that's a real challenge. And then the fourth is really looking at this in a multi-jurisdictional kind of way. You've got a lot of players at the table, so governance.
So how do you, let's start at the governance level and then work our way backwards.
Sure.
Because as you're talking about this, I'm thinking, okay, you have all these different jurisdictions. How on earth do we come up with a cohesive policy? Because I don't see that we'd be able to move forward unless everybody's kind of working off of the same sort of playlist.
Well, we do have one cohesive policy right now, and that's through our regional growth strategy, Metro Vancouver 2040, Shaping Our Future. So it was adopted in 2011, and it has a pretty high bar in terms of acceptance. It was adopted by all member jurisdictions, TransLink, the province, adjacent regional districts, and our board. And that was its first foray into industrial land. So we have regional land use designations on every parcel in the region. And for the first time, we have industrial and mixed employment land use designations. And what that means is every time a member jurisdiction wants to do a land use change, they've agreed first to come to the regional board and have a discussion about what the regional implications of that land use change are. So if they want to redevelop an industrial parcel to residential, they first have to come to the board and have a discussion. And so that's one regional policy.
Because one part affects the whole.
That's right.
Because if you start taking something out of it, then it's going to put pressure on
everything else.
Everything else. Does the development of that land though? So let's say we're moving forward. The development of all that land still becomes the jurisdiction of that one city or municipality. It's not a Metro Vancouver determination. The development company or the builder has to go in and say, okay, we're now dealing with the city of Burnaby, or we're dealing with Maple Ridge, or whatever.
Yeah, and they would have to go through a rezoning if they're wanting to convert that land. And we don't tend to get ahead of our member jurisdictions at Metro, so the application for that at a regional level would actually come from the municipality. So they're going through their rezoning process municipally, then they get partway through that process and they come to the region for a discussion about the implications there.
Is there something that can be done to I want to, fast track development permits when an opportunity comes up? And is that something that the region can play a role in?
It's something that we've heard a lot of interest in, and we hear it on multiple locations, not just around industrial, obviously commercial, residential, and so on, but we haven't played a role in that. We're not in the business of doing the local planning, right? So we don't do the rezoning at Metro. And so we work with our members to kind of look at ways to collectively streamline development processes, but it's not something that we would regulate at all.
But if we take, you mentioned transportation infrastructure, and it's tied to that, of course, is our relationship to the port. We are a port economy, and if we don't have those lands for distribution, for manufacturing, for whatever it is that can have access to various markets, then it's a challenge. Can the region play a role in ensuring that we build the appropriate transportation infrastructure?
Well, at Metro, we work really closely with TransLink, and so that would be, and they have a goods movement strategy that involves all jurisdictions. But again, it's not their jurisdiction to actually do the build. And so again, our role tends to be much more around coordinating our member jurisdictions to work together. And again, it's very helpful to have the port at the table when it comes to the industrial land strategy because they have a large interest in this. But there's a lot of region-serving jobs and a lot of region-serving pieces to the economy that the industrial lands serve. Almost a quarter of the region's jobs are on industrial land.
Wow.
About 23%, yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Is there a sense of urgency amongst the various communities, cities, municipalities, and so on in the Lower Mainland saying that we have to deal with this? Like, is it high enough on the the radar screen that people are saying, yeah, we better pay attention to this?
It's a harder one to get to the top of the list. Obviously, housing is the big driver right now. Industrial lands have a history of being dirty and smelly, and not something we necessarily need to pay attention to. But I think that we're starting to see that there's a real regional impact here when it comes to jobs and being able to attract a good workforce. And so I think it's starting to rise to the top, which is again why we're looking at a regional strategy.
Well, and I think that point that you just made right now, this equals jobs. It drives the economy. It is what sustains us.
That's right.
And yet it's not the stuff that captures the headlines and that people pay attention to. And so you're going to keep working with all different jurisdictions to try and help develop this and move this strategy forward of saying we're going to work as a coordinated group.
That's right, yeah. And we have our first task force meeting on the February 14th, and they're open to the public to take a look. We have got 3 studies coming forward, which I think will be really interesting. One is on the economic value of industrial lands in the region, and we've broken that into both trade enabling pieces that support the port and also the region serving pieces. And I think it's going to be an important study to take a look at the contributions that these lands make to our GDP as a region, as well as to the number of jobs and the fact that they tend to be higher paying jobs.
You think we're going to get through this, or do you think it could get tighter?
Well, I think that this is only one challenge in our region. The reality is that we have a constrained land base. And so we've got multiple legitimate land uses competing for a very constrained land base. And so I think that that's something that we have to struggle with as a region, is how do we use this most effectively?
Yeah.
There's a lot of interest around intensifying industrial uses as well. And I think that the market's in a place where that's starting to happen.
Well, and we do live in a province where the agricultural land reserve has been in place for 40 some odd years now?
Since 73, yeah.
And brought in by Dave Barrett. There's, it was a policy that you went, okay, we've got a wide open space. Well, now it's starting to put a pinch on that. Do we have to re-examine the way that we're also addressing agricultural lands in a way of ensuring that we accommodate the needs for industrial land growth?
Well, again, I'll go back to our regional growth strategy, which really seeks to balance those objectives. And so we also strongly support the protection of agricultural land for food production as contributor to the economy. And so I think that right now that the province is taking a look at ways to improve the ALC and the ALR policies, but I don't think it's about revisiting the land base per se. I think that's an important policy. And for us in our regional growth strategy, it's not just about protecting agricultural land, but it's a really effective urban containment tool, right? So it's a way of really managing and ensuring that we keep growth in a concentrated area, which helps us serve it by transit, which helps us serve it by efficient use of our utilities and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see as we move forward. Thanks for coming in and giving us this overview. I know the nuts and bolts there's a lot more there, but as you pointed out, there's a public meeting that's coming up on the 14th that people can go to, and I'm sure that there's information that people can find online as
Absolutely.
well, right?
Yep. Thanks so much.
Well, great, thanks. So coming up next is Chris Mccauley of CBRE, whose company just released a warning that reiterates and emphasizes the fact that we're in the danger zone when it comes to industrial land. And this is another opportunity for me to once again encourage you to tune into podcasts In the House and White Towel, which are on Apple Podcasts, thevancouversun.com, and theprovince.com. We'll be right back. Joining me now is Chris Mccauley of CBRE. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Your company just released a media advisory saying that industrial and commercial vacancy rates are kind of banging on the bottom of the floor, historical lows here. Why is this important? Like, why do we need all of us to care about whether or not business, whether it's retail or commercial or industrial, has space to live and grow?
Well, because for the reason of employment. We've always looked at the characterization of industrial lands, and people don't really know what that is. But when you start calling them employment lands, you start to get people and policymakers paying attention. So if we have no lands for employment, that's of great concern to our economy.
So are decision makers paying attention, those at the regional and municipal and city levels, or are they, so focused on residential that they forget about the fact that industrial is an important component?
Residential definitely gets all the headlines, and rightfully so. I think it does need the attention of the policymakers. But secondary, because we've always had some great economic growth in this province, and the GDP's always done very well, they haven't really paid any attention to it. It's only been now that it's gotten to a critical point that they're starting to pay attention and do some work at municipal and at provincial levels.
So how critical is it?
We're basically at a 0% vacancy. It's 1.4 on as what we report in the stats, but that really doesn't give anybody any options to our market. We consider a healthy market to be around that 4 to 5% mark.
So what happened? How did we wind up with such low industrial vacancy rates?
We are very challenged in this province, and especially in the Lower Mainland. We've got some old policies in place, some old zoning in place that have really kind of restrict the industrial. We've got old land use policies. We have physical restraints, being the ocean, the border, and the mountains, and we also have land constraints with the agricultural land reserve and things like that as well.
So you talk about restraints, zoning and regulatory. What are the ones that are the most challenging when it comes to the development of industrial property?
It's not going to be a very popular.
Is it a long list?
It is a long list, because what happens is it really is a municipal approach. Each municipality is going to be a different approach to what they need and what drives their employment lands. So in certain areas, it's zoning. Like in Vancouver, it's zoning. Right, we need to look at densifying and intensifying industrial land uses in Vancouver because there is nowhere to get us more industrial land in Vancouver.
Well, there's not much that's left in Vancouver at all anyways. It's been mostly converted to residential.
It has, and that's going on in Burnaby right now as well. But when we look at the overall picture of what the Lower Mainland needs, it's going to be a different approach in each area. So land use designations out in the valley or in different areas in the suburbs is what is need to be looked at, and then the zoning and regulatory issues within the municipalities of like Vancouver and Burnaby and Richmond need to be looked at differently.
And so is part of the problem that industrial goes to the bottom of the pile, and because the focus is so much on residential?
It is, and as I said at the beginning, they look at industrial, and I don't think they really understand what that means. They just still think that industrial is smokestacks and conveyors in the mills. They don't look at it as employment lands. And as different sectors change, like retail is becoming more industrial with the emergence of e-commerce, it really needs to be called just employment lands because that's exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm. We see Amazon taking over the old post office. How many other opportunities are there like that for a major employer to come in and say, there is a block that we can develop?
It's becoming very limited. We now have a lot of new entrants to the market, whereas before it was literally just people here expanding a little bit. We didn't get too many new entrants to the market. But right now, most of what's driving our demand is new entrants to the market. And they're looking and going, there just isn't anything of scale here or what they can occupy in a reasonable amount of time. So what's happening now is certain companies like that is looking south of the border in Seattle. They're also looking in Calgary.
If we don't do this, what does this do to our ability to call ourselves a major economic influence in the area? Are we just a nice place to live, or are we also a good place to work and live?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be major change until there's an economic impact felt. But I think what's going to happen is that's exactly what it's going to be, is if we don't have the opportunity to increase employment here, it's going to have a great effect on everything.
Now, there's a tendency to think, okay, well, you're talking about big companies, but this has a tremendous impact on all those startups and small businesses that are so fundamentally important to our economy. How does small business get hit hard as a result of this?
Well, a lot of the small businesses, and we've got some great success stories here of small businesses that have grown into these global recognized companies. They're not having the opportunity to expand within our municipalities or the Lower Mainland. So they're having to look elsewhere, or they just can't expand, right? Which is kind of stifling their growth to grow to their full potential. And what used to happen is that we used to have the Valley as the kind of the safety net, right? So when companies got forced out of Vancouver or Burnaby or the core because it got too expensive or there were no options, they would just move out to the Valley. That is no longer there. That safety net has now been used up.
Well, I was just at the mayor's event last week where they were all talking about the pressures that are being put on each of those municipalities and cities in the valley. They're going to see tremendous growth. And one of the things that I point out is that they only have islands of developable land in around ALR. And so this puts a real squeeze on that land. To reinforce your point.
It really does. And the ALR has always been a contentious issue and political nightmare, right? But it just needs to be looked at. Like this was brought back in 1973 with no real science behind it. And we need to look at what are the needs of the agricultural community, balance that with what are the needs of each municipality and the growth. Because people forget on the industrial side or on the employment land side, that's a lot of food production, food distribution. Over 30% of all our major deals on the industrial side are food related. So even those companies don't have any options to go to. So we really need to get everybody talking together.
Well, can't we start to get into mixed use, have vertical farms? Because as I understand, the greenhouse technology is that provides the opportunity to grow up as well as out.
And I think every industry has done that. I think the agricultural industry is doing more on less, and I think industrial is also doing more on less and intensifying and densifying.
So from your perspective, what are the most important things that municipalities and cities need to do? Or do we also need to look at the idea of saying, look, we have to stop being a series of 20-some-odd collection of jurisdictions and start to act far more cohesively? And I know that Metro Vancouver has part of that role, but it doesn't have the jurisdiction.
They don't, but I also think, yes, they have to work together, but the answers and solutions are different for every municipality. So it has to be looked at municipality by municipality because the solutions are different. What's going to work in Vancouver isn't necessarily the answer for what Delta needs. So we do have to look at it individually and what's the right approach. Is it multi-level industrial? Maybe in certain areas. Is it densifying, intensifying? Yes. As far as the agricultural community, I think we need to address their needs. I'm not an expert on that, but what are their needs? And how can we balance all the land use? And especially when we take out industrial lands for residential, how are we replacing that? It's great that we're taking these lands and providing residence for people, but then where are you replacing the jobs for these residents as well?
So is it most important that we start talking about this, or do you have a laundry list of 4 or 5 things that you say councils need to pay attention to?
Well, right now I think a lot of municipalities are starting to do the right thing. Metro Vancouver has been very active over years addressing this issue, but I think it's all going to boil down to land use policy, and ultimately those 3 letters are going to be said about the ALC. And nobody's going to want to touch that.
ALR.
Well, the ALC that controls the ALR,
right, okay,
Agricultural Land Commission.
Yes, right.
And because they do control most of the lands, and what was done in the 70s may not be what we need now. And I'm not saying that we take away food security. All I'm saying is, what does the agricultural community need? Is it more land? Or is it other things? Can we look at not creating new industrial parks, but can we look at the ways of expanding our existing ones to providing a little bit more? I never want to see us be a sea of these warehouses throughout the Lower Mainland, but how do we provide the balance between what the agricultural community needs and what the employment community needs?
And there isn't going to be an easy answer to that, is there?
There's not going to be an easy answer because the tough decisions have to be made.
But we do need to start talking about it, because if we don't, we won't address it.
And unfortunately, we'll address it when it's too late, right? Because right now, we've let it get down to this state of being 1.4% vacancy. And I honestly believe that once there's some economic impact of companies leaving our area, which we've already been seeing, and companies that say, I would love to come and set up in Vancouver, but you have no options for me. Until we start seeing that on a consistent basis, then I think the policymakers will react. Instead of being proactive, they'll be reactive.
We'll just hope that we don't get to that point.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. Thanks for coming in and sharing this with us.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. So coming up next, Vancouver Sun business reporter Derek Penner on the impact of tight commercial and industrial real estate markets, not just on businesses, but on all of us. We'll be right back. Welcome. Thanks for joining me.
No problem.
You've been a business reporter for a number of years. The state of business and we don't hear about it very often from a real estate perspective, namely as in tenants or needing to buy property. What's the situation right now?
Everything is predicated on how residential real estate has performed. If you're in commercial real estate, if you're in retail in particular, a lot of it is driven by changes in zoning that create higher density residential zones. You're renting property in those zones. All of a sudden, they're a lot more expensive, and those have sort of a flow-through impact on your rent.
So when you talk to business owners, what are they telling you about this? How are they telling you that it's bad? Is it just a cost of business, or what's the sense that you get about the reaction to it?
Well, it's bad. It's there's a lot of pressure on municipalities to perhaps take a second look at how they approach taxation. In a lot of cases, you'll have in retail in particular, you'll have nice sort of long-standing businesses that are in a location that is all of a sudden has high density potential, and it's taxed on the property is taxed on that potential rather than what's going on in the property. So all of a sudden they go from having a tax bill of say a few $1,000s to tens of thousands of dollars.
And yet nothing changed for them.
No, that's if you talk to Philip, or I forget his name.
Ninth grade, yeah.
If you talk to property appraisers, there's pressure to get municipalities, or it's not municipalities. It would have to be a sort of provincial change to allow municipalities to tax on, sort of have a dual tax rate. You sort of tax on what is happening rather than the potential.
I think a lot of people don't realize that for a business, when the value of the property that they're in goes up, the tax on that property goes up, and that tax flows through to the business, not to the landlord, but to the business.
Yeah, well, that's the convention of triple net leases.
Yeah.
If you own a property, you pass on the sort of cost of doing business to your tenants.
Yeah.
So it's the convention. It's if you're a dry cleaner sitting in what was a one-story, or what still is a one-story commercial property that has the potential for 6 stories of residential, you have to sort of press a lot more shirts to sort of generate that kind of income, and it's probably not possible. So,
right.
Yeah.
And those increases can equal jobs. I think that people don't realize, you start to see this tax increase, it plays itself out in lost jobs, and the people who are working there then have to work harder.
Yeah. There's sort of a dual pressure on a lot of businesses. If you're in the service sector, there's a lot of cafes, bagel shops, you name it, that are having a hard time trying to find employees because of the cost of living. Then you sort of turn around and you sort of have these increased costs passed on to them. There's a lot of businesses having a tougher time out there.
And then when it comes to the industrial sector, so we're talking commercial, as in retail commercial. There's also commercial real estate for businesses that are doing business-to-business kind of work, or services and so on. But when we get out into the industrial sector, we see a very, very sparse landscape.
Yes.
And from your perspective, are you seeing that governments are addressing this, that they're making this an issue that has to be fundamentally taken care of?
Yes. It's difficult to take seriously, though, when you have all these competing interests.
Yeah.
You have the competing interest of trying to create more and affordable housing. At the same time, you don't want to squeeze out industrially zoned land. We can't make more of the land, sort of hemmed in by the agricultural land reserve and growing municipalities.
Well, industrial land has literally been entirely squeezed out of Vancouver and Burnaby, and is getting pushed further and further out. And then, of course, as you just pointed out, then they run into the situation with the ALR.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't know. What does this do to our ability to grow and become a truly important and central regional economic center?
I think in a lot of ways you have to really rethink transportation. The industrial land, it's all about logistics now. We live in a delivery-oriented society, so the industrial landscape is all about being able to efficiently receive goods in a large space, and then get them out as efficiently as you can. If you look at Amazon, I don't know where they were 10, 15 years ago, but they have two very large and are about to embark upon their third fulfillment center, as they call them, essentially gigantic in
Warehouses,
distribution
I guess,
warehouses.
yeah.
I believe they're working with a developer on 450,000 square foot center in Tsawwassen.
This is Amazon. I didn't even know this. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
It's 450,000 square feet. If you think of the field inside BC Place Stadium, that's almost 5 of those.
5 of them.
So
Holy smokes.
that's the kind of scale industrial users would dearly love to have. But again, it's having a difficult time squeezing them in, and they're going to have to look further out. So,
Yeah, like much further out. And then, as you point out, the transportation infrastructure then gets taxed. We only just rebuilt Port Mann Highway 1.
Yeah.
We're going to need more.
Yeah. That's a tricky one. It's how do you use that more efficiently? How do you, perhaps use the rail network more? In the past, I don't know why this hasn't come up. It seems to come up in cycles, but there's every once in a while you'll hear proposals of using the Fraser River more as a sort of
Transportation byway.
yeah.
Both for commercial and individual or private transportation.
Well, more for the logistics.
Yeah.
Finding if they could find a rail point, to have more barge traffic carrying freight up and down the river. That's an option that gets floated from time to time.
But then I think you're right. That does open up other opportunities to put industrial properties close to the river.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like an old idea, because wasn't the river the main transportation system going back for centuries?
Yeah, it was. Before there was a highway, there were riverboats.
So what is old is new again.
Might be.
Yeah.
It might have to.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, and of course I know that you'll be watching all these different pressures that businesses find themselves under, but this is a really important one here in Vancouver. Okay, thanks for coming in and joining me. Thanks for tuning in. Now, just before I go, let me encourage you one more time to tune into podcasts In the House and White Towel, which you will find on Apple Podcasts, thevancouversun.com, and theprovince.com. Housing Matters, the Vancouver Real Estate Show, is produced by Oh Boy Productions for the Vancouver Sun and Province. The production of this show is only possible thanks to the talents of Derek Hayter, Arnold Cheng, and Greta Gibson. I'm Stuart McNish. Thanks for joining us on Housing Matters, the Vancouver Real Estate Show. See you next time.